Hi there, my name's Iain Brennan. I'm a professor of criminology at the University of Hull. I've been doing research on violence for about 15 years. I started my career during the last knife crime epidemic in around 2006, 2007. Since then, I've done research on alcohol-related violence and domestic abuse. My career has come full circle back into trying to understand the motivations and the lives of people who choose to carry weapons. In this talk, I'm going to discuss something that's missing from the UK literature, and that is longitudinal predictors of weapon carrying. So can we learn or can we understand the weapon carriers of next year based on their characteristics, their environments, and their attitudes and behaviours this year? Along the way in this talk, I'll discuss sales of earthquake insurance, the use of images of knives on police Twitter. But for the most part, we'll be talking about the role of fear and the role of experience and trust in the police on weapon carrying in the future. I hope you find this interesting. If you do find it interesting and you'd like to discuss this further with me, my contact details are on the slides, both at the start and the beginning, along with some links to some papers that I've written about the characteristics of weapon carriers. We don't need to be looking at my face for the rest of this talk, so I'm going to skip into the slides and begin talking about weapon carrying and preparation for adversity. So I'm sure that many of you watching this are familiar with, if not fans of, Jerry Ratcliffe's Reducing Crime podcast. Jerry's interview with Marcus Felsen is full of brilliant advice, but for me, the best line in it is, "Simple as it needs to be, but no simpler." And that's where I want to start talking about weapon carrying. Over the past few years, lots of people have found the time to formulate and express their theories of why people carry weapons. Most lay and some academic theories have concepts like fear and self-protection at their centre. However, while fear and self-defence may be important emotions for some people, and carrying for protection is a very common explanation of weapon carrying in empirical research, this always seems to me to be too narrow and simplistic and restrictive a frame for thinking about this behaviour. There's a small but pretty convincing literature that shows that weapons have many more purposes beyond fear and self-protection. The main one is that they're very effective in doing violent harm. They are the tools of violence, and they make doing injury to other people more successful. But they also serve instrumental purposes, so they can create a fearsome identity that can make a person's criminal life easier. So if you have a reputation for carrying weapons, particularly gratuitously serious weapons like machetes and things like that, people will think twice about messing with you. Weapon carrying also cements a shared collective identity among groups. So if you have a group of young people who, I hesitate to use the phrase gangs, but if you have a group of people who have a shared sort of criminal activities, carrying weapons is a totem of their group membership, and it can cement that collective identity. Another theory which Bernard Harcourt describes in his, for me, the best book about weapon carrying, The Language of the Gun from 2006, he talks about entitlement in some people who carry weapons. He suggests that some people for whom the police cannot protect them, or the state cannot protect them because of maybe the geography, the places that they live, or the individual behaviours that they engage in, and most of the time these are criminal. If they can't depend on the state to protect them from violence, they often feel entitled to carry a weapon. So there are more than fear is just one reason for carrying weapons, but there are many more. Weapon carrying happens in the simplest terms because someone lives in a world where they anticipate violence, and that can be violent action or violent presentation or identity formation. Fear and self-protection may be part of that, but we shouldn't block off these other explanations or ways of thinking about weapon carrying. So I want to talk about weapon carrying as anticipating violence, or thinking about violence happening in the future. So we're taking a step back from fear to a simple theory that weapon carrying is about anticipation of violence. Simple but no simpler, in Marcus's words. We have a great many studies about the characteristics of people who carry weapons compared to those who don't. There's not a great deal of studies from the UK, but there are lots from the US, and we're actually fortunate that we can use a lot of this US literature. So despite there being different laws about weapon carrying in the US compared to the UK, the drivers of illegal weapon carrying by young people are pretty much the same. And these are consistent in that weapon carriers tend to be male, they tend to be adolescents into early adulthood, they tend to have histories of violence, as do their friends. They have very little trust in the police, and they tend to live in places with higher than normal rates of violence. What we know about weapon carrying tends to come from cross-sectional studies, however. So one-off studies that talk about the things that people do simultaneously or within the same time frame. Unfortunately, these cross-sectional studies can't tell us about the weapon carriers of the future. They can only say what happened at the same time as weapon carrying or within the same time frame as weapon carrying. And that's problematic if we want to predict and if we want to develop more rigorous theories about weapon carrying. We need to know what comes before when in terms of the initiation of violence. And in terms of prediction, we want to know about the things like the consistency of weapon carrying over time. So it's important that we have longitudinal information to understand the temporal order of this, so that we're not looking at some behavior being a consequence of weapon carrying rather than weapon carrying being consequence of some behavior. So to understand future violence, we need to develop better theories that have a temporal order to them, and we need better longitudinal data that allows us to test these theories. If anybody from the Home Office is listening to this, we haven't had a longitudinal survey of self-reported delinquency on a national scale since 2006. It is high time that we have a new one. So before I get into sort of formulating the theories, we'll take a quick left turn through the research on risk analysis. So risk analysis is a field of research that blends psychology, economics, epidemiology, maths, sociology, geography, and a range of other disciplines to understand how people understand and respond to uncertainty. So uncertainty is what's going to happen in the future. Much of this field is concerned with adverse events, major adverse events, natural disasters like flooding, volcanoes, and, dare I say it, pandemics. A common theme to this research, one of the most consistent findings in this area, is that individuals don't think about or respond to danger in predictable or rational ways. And many of the things that influence our understanding and response to risk have no business doing so. The question I want to ask is, can we think about serious violence as a major adverse event? And if so, what can risk analysis tell us about how people perceive risk? The important extension of that for weapon carrying is, can we think about weapon carrying as a form of preparing for risk or as a form of preparing for adversity? If so, can we take the existing literature from risk analysis and apply it to our understanding of weapon carrying? So although it seems so logical that feeling vulnerable should be in some ways correlated with action to reduce that vulnerability, the evidence shows that this isn't the case. Risk analysis literature and criminology literature, in fact, is littered with these counterintuitive, or what you would at least think of as irrational correlations, where the people who are at greatest risk or who feel that they are at greatest risk actually are not, but the people who are at risk do little about it. Many theories of weapon carrying have attributed emotions to weapon carrying, describing the drivers for this behaviour as fear, but in reality anticipation or likelihood are more accurate mechanisms. So if risk perception or feeling vulnerable, fear or worry about an adverse event don't predict action, what does? In risk analysis literature, the most consistent predictor of doing something to mitigate risk is actually having experienced it in the past, or having experienced something like it in the past. So just as sales of earthquake insurance skyrocket after an earthquake, having direct experience of something negative means it's easy to imagine it happening again, and that's what drives people's preparation for that risk or preparation for that adversity in the future. So if we apply this to weapon carrying, we have two hypotheses to explain preparing for violence by carrying a weapon. That is, worrying about being involved in violence and experience of being involved in violence. And these two form the basis for two hypotheses. However, there's one other really important factor from the risk analysis literature that we don't discuss enough in understanding violence, and how it interacts with fear and how it interacts with direct experience, and that's the role of the authorities. So in natural disaster research, authorities loom large. Most disasters are far too complex and massive for an individual to handle themselves. Therefore, they rely on experts to inform them about the probability of an event, and also how serious it might be for them and how urgent it is to act. In flooding, the authorities would be the Met Office and many others. Who is responsible for making the public aware of their risk in relation to violence is less clear. But in recent years, this role has been taken on by the police, government, and the voluntary sector. Authorities, as opposed to experts, are a wide range of organisations who take responsibility for protecting the public from this threat. So in flooding, it's the Environment Agency and others, and other emergency services. And in violence, the authorities who are responsible for protecting the population from violence are the police. But obviously there are other statutory and non-statutory services involved. So in terms, what the risk analysis literature shows is that in terms of preparing for adversity, there's actually a slightly perverse consequence of trusting the authorities to be able to give you accurate information about your vulnerability, and also trusting the authorities to give you accurate to be able to protect you. And what the risk analysis literature finds is that the more an individual trusts the authorities to protect them, the less prepared they tend to be for that adversity. So if we want to flip that around and think about people who have low trust in authorities, what we would hypothesize is that having little trust in authority motivates a person to prepare themselves for adversity. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to sort of to see where I'm going with this, in that it's likely that having little trust in the authorities to protect themselves, just as in Bernard Harcourt's entitlement theory, if we have little trust, if an individual has little trust in authorities to protect them, then it's going to increase their likelihood of doing something to prepare for that violence, and that preparation is weapon carrying. So we have two theories transplanted from the field of risk analysis. First is that whatever the driver of weapon carrying, fear or experience, it'll be moderated by the extent to which someone trusts the authorities, specifically the police, to protect them. So we have worrying about violent victimization will predict weapon carrying in year 2 is my first theory. Secondly, experience of violence in year 1 will predict weapon carrying in year 2 if an individual has low trust in the police. So I tested these theories using the best national level longitudinal data set that we have on self-reported offending and victimization, and that is the Offending Crime and Justice Survey. It's very old now. It ran between 2003 and 2006, but it is a very useful data set, and as I said, it's the only national level longitudinal data set that we have for this. I'm just going to use the last 2 years of this, which contains data from around 4,200 10 to 25 year olds. So they were interviewed twice, 1 year apart. And there are hundreds of useful variables in this data set, but I'm limiting the analysis to the main theoretical variables. That's weapon carrying in the past year, measured in 2005 and 2006. But then worry about victimization in 2005, amount of direct experience of violence. That's a combination of both victimization and perpetration. And it also includes some other what it regards as important covariates, which has been shown to be very important in the cross-sectional literature. That's past weapon carrying, peers in trouble with the police, and histories of drug use. So what we're trying to do is use a very simple logistic regression model to see what of these 2005 characteristics predict weapon carrying in 2006. So 4 sets of models here. Firstly, what's the effect of worry about being a victim of violence in the future on weapon carrying in the future? So what we can see from this is that worry about victimization does not have any, at a univariate or a bivariate level, does not have any predictive power. It does not say anything about weapon carrying in the future. So you can see there at the top of the graph that the confidence intervals, those thin horizontal bars, they include the number 1. So that would suggest that there's no statistically significant impact. If we control for other variables like past weapon carrying and peers in trouble with the police, there's still no statistically significant predictive power of the amount that somebody is worried about their future victimization. I think it's important to put this idea about fear and worry about victimization to bed, being predictors of weapon carrying to bed, because there's very little evidence that's actually the case. So in the second line, so the third line of the graph, violence experience, we can show that it shows that experience of violence does predict later weapon carrying. So the point estimates and the confidence intervals are way over to the right of the graph, and this suggests a strong bivariate relationship. And putting this in terms of probability, it shows that the probability of carrying a weapon increases by around 8% for every violent incident experienced by an individual in the year before. So just adding some covariates to this model to see if to control for other factors like peers being in trouble with the police and past weapon carrying and recent drug use, it still shows that direct experience is a statistically significant predictor of future weapon carrying. So direct experience here increases risk by around 4%, or the probability of carrying a weapon by around 4% for each incident. So as I said earlier, I'm interested in how trust in the police influences the relationship between fear and direct experience on weapon carrying. I think we can dispense with the worry weapon carrying relationship and focus just on experience of violence and see how this varies according to trust in the police. And this is where things get really interesting. So I've done this as a graph that moves just to try and tell this as a story. So I'll move it along iteratively. So at the start, you can see here we have we had 3 lines. At the bottom, we have people who have lots and lots of trust in the police. And that's about 50% of the population, of the sample, if memory serves me correctly. Then we have people who have some trust in the police, that middle line, and then the yellow line at the top is people who have little or no trust in the police. So at the moment, as what we can see on the graph, is that this is the interceptor. This is the rate of the probability of carrying a weapon in the future according to these 3 lines. So at the bottom, the people who have lots of trust in the police have a probability somewhere around 2%. The people who have some trust in the police have a probability around 3%, and people who have little or no trust in the police but haven't had any experience of violence have a probability of carrying a weapon somewhere around 4. So what we're going to see as the graph unfolds is what is the interaction between trust in the police and experience of violence. So what you would expect is, if there is no impact of trust in the police on the influence of direct experience on future weapon carrying, then those 3 lines would stay parallel and they would continue to stay low across the graph going from the right. So if you can try and visualize, this is the life of someone over the course of 2005. What's happening to them is they're experiencing more and more violence, and these lines are the probability that weapon carrying will happen next year. And around 3 incidents, we start to see this massive increase in the probability of carrying a weapon. But in the other groups, the people who have high trust in the police, or at least some trust in the police, their likelihood of carrying a weapon goes up a little bit. But nothing like the influence of having little or no trust in the police. So what we're seeing here is this really strong interacting effect of direct experience and trust in the police, leading to much higher probabilities of weapon carrying. So that graph finishes for that group who have little or no trust in the police, around 24% probability of them carrying a weapon next year if they had this huge history of violent victimization and violent perpetration, coupled with low trust in the police. So what have we learned from these analyses, these longitudinal analyses, looking at the predictors of who will be carrying a weapon next year? Firstly, what we can see is that there are many factors that precede weapon carrying, that predict weapon carrying, and they all, to some extent, fall into the category of criminogenic to some extent. So more experience of violence, having extreme or at least low rates of trust in the police. There seems to be a really strong impact of or consistency in weapon carrying, and the more trouble, the greater proportion of peers in trouble increases weapon carrying in the future. It's important to emphasize that these relationships are all non-linear. That we are talking about extremes of each of these variables. So extreme amounts of violence, extremely low rates of trust in the police, extremely high rates of having peers in trouble. Recent drug use and weapon carrying are binary, so we can't talk about linearity here. But it's the people who are at the extremes of these phenomena are the ones who are at greatest risk of carrying weapons in the future. So what are the theoretical implications of this? Firstly, we can show that longitudinally weapon carrying forms part of a wider pattern of criminogenic factors. Fear has very little predictive value here. Despite all the theories and despite all the sort of people talking about weapon carrying being a consequence of self-defense or worry about future victimization, it actually has very little predictive value. What we do know is that when low trust in the authorities mixes with violence, the implications are serious. What we need to do next is to test these findings with the population who have never carried a weapon, to look at the causes, and that's possible with the Offending Crime and Justice Survey, although the sample numbers are pretty small, and that's some work for me for the future. Fear or risk perception don't drive weapon carrying. I think that's a really important thing to take away from this. And this has some implications for the idea of police showing knives on Twitter. The general theory is that showing knives on Twitter creates a sense of fear, or at least creates some sort of normative feeling, or feeling that weapon carrying is normative, or at least highly prevalent. Certainly, if that and that this high prevalence makes people carry weapons because they feel that many other people are. if the mechanism for this is, if the proposed mechanism for this is fear, then there's no, it seems unlikely that showing pictures of knives on Twitter is going to increase the rate of knife carrying. And I think what we can safely say is there's probably no effect of showing these images in the absence of direct experience of violence. So for the vast majority of the population, there's probably no impact whatsoever. There is possibly an interacting effect if somebody has huge rates of experience of violence. But for my money, pictures of knives on Twitter are not the impact, are not the thing that's going to drive them to carry a weapon next year. Other practical implications of this are that we need to focus on engagement with young people following initiation of violence. So there's a strong impact of direct experience of violence, whether it's as a victim or as a perpetrator. And it's the more the person experiences it, the greater the risk of their future weapon carrying. So the earlier the intervention and the engagement, the better. And there's a really strong impact of criminal peers or peers being in trouble with the police on future weapon carrying. So there's also good evidence that we need to intervene with peers collectively or intervene with groups rather than individuals. And the final thing to take away from this about the role of trust in the police is that no matter what choices a person makes and what dangers they put themselves in, or whatever the riskiness of their environment, and whether a person wants protection or not, the state has a responsibility to and needs to protect them from violence to prevent future weapon carrying and future harm. Well, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that interesting. I've just put some QR codes on the side of the screen there that are links to articles that I've written. They're actually the same article. One is if you have a subscription or access to the British Journal of Criminology, and the second one is just the open access unformatted version of that paper. If you would like to talk to me more, I'd love to hear from you. My email address is i.brennan@hull.ac.uk, or you can contact me through Twitter at Iain Brennan. So I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the talks through this conference. I hope to see you in person at the next EBP in 2021. Thank you very much.